Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are diving into 10 accounts that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the places people call home. These are not tales of fiction or urban legends passed down through generations. These are real testimonies from individuals who discovered that the walls around them were hiding secrets far more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. Each story unfolds in the cold, unforgiving nights of November, when darkness falls early and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. I need everyone listening to understand something before I start. I am still living in Portland. The lease does not end until March, and breaking it would cost me 3 months' rent that I simply do not have saved. I was 31 years old, freshly promoted to social media manager at a marketing firm downtown, and desperate for a place where I could finally afford to live alone after years of splitting cramped apartments with strangers who never cleaned and always ate my food. When I found the listing online in late October, it felt like fate. A one-bedroom unit in a newer apartment complex on the east side, hardwood floors, updated appliances, even a small balcony overlooking what the photos described as a quiet courtyard. The rent was reasonable for the neighborhood, and the landlord responded to my inquiry within hours. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed, a fresh start in a space that was entirely mine. The building itself was one of those modern constructions that tries too hard to look industrial. Exposed brick in the lobby, metal railings, Edison bulbs hanging from thick black cords. My unit was on the 3rd floor, tucked at the end of a hallway that always seemed dimmer than the rest of the building because one of the overhead lights had been flickering since the day I moved in. The apartment was perfect at first. Sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows each morning, and the walls were thick enough that I rarely heard my neighbors. There was Mrs. Chen, 2 doors down, who smiled whenever we passed in the hallway, and a young couple across from me who kept to themselves but always held the elevator door when they saw me coming. Everything changed on a Saturday afternoon in mid-November. I had been living there for exactly 3 weeks when I noticed the first package. It was sitting in the hallway outside the unit next to mine, apartment 3F, which had been vacant since I moved in. The landlord had mentioned something about it being between tenants during my walkthrough, but I'd never seen anyone go in or out. The package was a plain brown box, maybe the size of a shoebox, with no return address, and a shipping label that had been partially torn off. I figured it was a delivery mistake, or something the previous tenant had ordered before moving out, so I left it there and went about my day. The next morning, another package appeared in the same spot. This one was larger, rectangular, wrapped in that same generic brown paper with another damaged label. By Tuesday, there were 4 packages stacked against the door of 3F, varying sizes, all with that same deliberate anonymity about them. No logos, no company names, just strips of torn shipping labels that revealed nothing. I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen when I saw her getting her mail, and she frowned, saying she had noticed them too and had already called the building manager twice. He keeps saying someone will pick them up, she told me, but her tone suggested she did not believe it. That Thursday evening, I was coming home from a late meeting around 900, my arms full of takeout and my laptop bag cutting into my shoulder, when I saw someone standing in the hallway outside 3F. At first, I thought it was the building manager finally dealing with the packages, but as I got closer, I realized this person was too thin, too still. It was a man, maybe in his 50s, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up despite the building's heated interior. He was not moving the packages or unlocking the door. He was just standing there with his hand resting on the doorknob, his head tilted slightly like he was listening for something on the other side. I stopped walking about 10 feet away, suddenly very aware that we were alone in this hallway, and my keys were buried somewhere in my purse. The man turned his head slowly in my direction, and even though the hood shadowed most of his face, I could see his eyes, pale and focused, studying me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. We stayed like that for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds before he turned back to the door, tried the handle once more, and then walked past me toward the stairwell without saying a word. His shoulder brushed mine as he passed, and I caught a smell of cigarette smoke and something chemical, like cleaning products mixed with gasoline. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to his footsteps echo down the stairwell before I finally fumbled my keys out and got inside my apartment. I locked the door, threw the deadbolt, and even pushed my small dining chair under the handle like I had seen in movies, even though I was not sure if that actually worked. My hands were shaking as I set down my food, and I could not eat any of it. Instead, I stood by my door, looking through the peephole at the empty hallway, at those packages still stacked against 3F, and wondered who that man was and why he had been trying to get inside an empty apartment. The next morning, I called the building manager, a guy named Derek who always sounded mildly annoyed whenever tenants contacted him. I told him about the packages, about the man in the hallway, about how I felt unsafe with someone lurking around trying to access a vacant unit. Derek sighed like I was ruining his day and said he would look into it, but his tone made it clear he thought I was overreacting. He mentioned that the previous tenant had moved out suddenly in September, and maybe some mail was still being forwarded, nothing to worry about. When I pressed him about the man trying the door, he got defensive, saying the building had security cameras, and if there was a real problem, it would have been flagged. That night, I decided to document everything myself. I set up my phone on a small tripod I used for work videos, angled it toward my door, and let it record while I tried to sleep. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside my door. I lay there in the dark, heart hammering, listening as someone tested my doorknob. It turned slightly, stopped by the lock, then released. The footsteps moved next door to 3F, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into a lock, metal scraping against metal, followed by a door opening and closing softly. I grabbed my phone and checked the recording. The motion-activated feature had captured everything. At 2:27, a shadow moved past my door. At 2:29, a hand reached into frame, trying my doorknob. At 231, the same hooded figure from before stood in front of 3F, pulled a key from his pocket and let himself inside. The door closed behind him, and the hallway went still again. The next morning, I took the video straight to Derek at the building office. I showed him the footage, pointed out the timestamps, and demanded to know who had access to that apartment. His expression shifted from annoyed to concerned as he watched, and he finally admitted that the previous tenant, a woman named Sarah Voss, had left suddenly after filing a police report about harassment. The landlord had changed the locks immediately, and no keys were supposed to exist outside the management office. Whoever this man was, he either had a copy from before or had made one somehow. Derek called the police while I waited in his office, and 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. They reviewed my video, took my statement, and then went upstairs to check 3F. I followed them up, staying a few steps behind as they knocked on the door, announced themselves, and then used the master key to open it. The smell hit us immediately. Stale air mixed with something sour and organic, like rotting food left in a closed space. The apartment was not empty. It was filled with packages, dozens of them, stacked along the walls, piled on the kitchen counter, covering the floor of the living room. Some were opened, revealing contents that made my skin crawl. Clothing, mostly women's, in various sizes. Photographs printed from social media, faces I did not recognize at first. Notebooks filled with handwritten notes, dates, times, locations, routines. One of the officers started going through the notebooks while the other called for backup. I stood in the doorway, unable to look away, and that was when I saw my own face staring back at me from one of the photographs pinned to the wall. It was a picture of me walking into the building, taken from across the street, dated 2 weeks before I even signed my lease. Underneath it, written in small, precise handwriting, was my full name, my work schedule, my car make and model, and a note that read, "3rd floor, end unit, east-facing windows, alone." The officer turned to me and asked if I recognized anyone else in the photos. I stepped closer, my legs feeling like they might give out, and looked at the dozens of faces covering the walls. Some were women around my age, others older, a few teenagers. Then I saw her, Sarah Voss. Her photo was larger than the others, printed on glossy paper and positioned in the center like a shrine. Around it were smaller images showing her leaving the building, getting into her car, sitting in a coffee shop, all taken from a distance, all without her knowledge. Beneath her photo was a list, dates going back over a year, tracking her movements, her visitors, even her garbage disposal schedule. The police spent hours processing the scene. They found more evidence linking the man to at least 6 other women in the Portland area, all of whom had reported feeling watched or followed, but had never been able to prove it. The notebooks contained detailed plans, not just surveillance, but intentions. One entry from early November described me as the replacement, noting how I had moved into the building shortly after Sarah left, and how I matched his preferred profile, whatever that meant. Another entry, dated just 3 days before I found the packages, included a crude map of my apartment layout with notes about which windows did not have locks and which walls were thin enough to hear through. They arrested him that same night. His name was Leonard Pritchard, a 54-year-old man with no prior criminal record who worked as a maintenance contractor for several apartment buildings in the area. That was how he had access to keys, how he knew which units were vacant, how he could move through buildings without raising suspicion. He had been using 3F as a staging area for months, storing his surveillance materials, planning his next steps. And the packages I had seen were deliveries he had sent to himself using fake names, so he would have an excuse to be in the hallway. The landlord offered to let me break my lease without penalty, but finding another place would take time and money I did not have, so I stayed. I changed my locks, installed a security bar on my door, and covered my windows with blackout curtains that never open all the way. Mrs. Chen moved out 2 weeks later, saying she could not sleep knowing what had been happening next door. The couple across the hall left shortly after. Now the hallway is mostly empty, and the flickering light still has not been fixed. Sometimes I stand by my door at night and look through the peephole at 3F. The police cleared it out and the landlord repainted, but no one has moved in since. The hallway stays quiet now, but that does not make me feel safer. I keep thinking about those notebooks, about the lists and maps and photos, about how many nights he stood outside my door, testing the lock, waiting for the right moment. I still live here. The lease does not end until March, and every time I hear footsteps in the hallway, every time a package appears by someone's door, I check the recording on my phone and wonder if he was the only one watching, or if someone else learned his methods and decided to continue what he started. I need to tell this story while the details are still fresh, while I can still remember the exact sequence of events that led me to discover what happened in this house. I am 26 years old, a freelance photographer specializing in real estate and architectural work, and I moved to Boise, Idaho in early November after landing a contract with a property management company that needed someone to document their rental listings across the valley. The pay was decent, and they offered to set me up in one of their properties at a reduced rate while I worked for them. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. I would have a place to live and work. They would have someone on call for last-minute photography needs, and everyone would benefit. The house they gave me was a small 2-bedroom ranch-style home on the north side of Boise, tucked into an older neighborhood where the trees were tall enough to block most of the streetlights, and the houses sat far enough apart that you could not see your neighbor's windows from your own. The property manager, a woman named Linda who spoke quickly and always seemed to be handling 3 crises at once. He explained that the previous tenant had broken their lease suddenly in September, and the owner wanted someone in the house quickly to avoid it sitting vacant through winter. She handed me the keys on a Tuesday afternoon, pointed out the location on a map, and told me utilities were already on and I could move in whenever I was ready. I drove out that same evening with my camera gear and a few boxes of personal items, planning to spend the night and get a feel for the space before deciding if I wanted to bring over the rest of my belongings from the extended stay motel where I had been crashing since arriving in town. The house looked tired but solid from the outside. Beige siding, brown trim, a covered front porch with 2 wooden posts that needed repainting. The yard was overgrown, and leaves had piled up against the foundation, but that was expected for a place that had been empty for weeks. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The interior was clean but impersonal, the kind of rental where nothing matches and everything is chosen for durability rather than aesthetics. Beige carpet throughout, white walls, basic light fixtures that gave off that harsh LED glow. The living room opened directly into a small dining area, which connected to a galley kitchen with laminate counters and appliances that looked like they had been purchased sometime in the early 2000s. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The whole place smelled faintly of cleaning products and something else, something musty and organic that I assumed was coming from the carpets or the ventilation system. I set up my air mattress in the larger bedroom and spent the first night editing photos on my laptop, listening to the house settle around me. Old houses make noise, I know that. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes, pipes clank when water moves through them, foundations shift. But there was something about the sounds in that house that felt wrong from the start. Around 11 that first night, I heard what sounded like scratching coming from somewhere inside the walls. Not frantic scratching like an animal trapped, but slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingernails across drywall from the inside. I stopped working and listened. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, and then stopped completely. The next morning, I started exploring the house more thoroughly with my photographer's eye, looking at angles and light sources, checking for structural issues I might need to document. That was when I noticed the bedroom closet in the smaller room did not sit flush with the wall. There was a gap, maybe half an inch, running along the left side of the frame. I pulled the closet door open and found it mostly empty except for a few wire hangers and a plastic storage bin shoved into the back corner. I dragged the bin out, thinking the previous tenant had forgotten it, and found it filled with clothes. Women's clothes, mostly casual items like jeans and sweaters, all in sizes that looked too small for the bin. Someone had packed these in a hurry, stuffing them down without folding. Underneath the clothes, I found a wallet. Brown leather, worn at the edges, still containing a driver's license with a photo of a young woman named Melissa Howell. The license was from Idaho, issued 3 years ago, with an address in Meridian, which was about 15 minutes from where I was standing. I set the wallet aside and kept digging. Beneath it were more personal items. A phone charger, a set of keys, a small notebook with a floral cover. I opened the notebook and found pages filled with handwritten entries, not exactly a diary, but more like observations. Dates, times, brief descriptions of sounds or movements. The entries started in late July and ended abruptly on September 14th. I sat on the floor of that empty bedroom and read through the notebook from beginning to end. Melissa had moved into this house in July after taking a job with a tech company downtown. Her entries started optimistic, describing the house as quiet and private, perfect for someone who worked remotely and needed space to focus. But by mid-August, the tone shifted. She started noting strange occurrences. Items moved from where she had left them. Doors she remembered closing found open in the morning. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when she was the only one home. At first, she rationalized everything. The house was old, she wrote. Maybe the doors did not latch properly. Maybe she was more tired than she realized and forgot where she put things. By September, her entries became shorter and more frantic. September 3rd. Heard breathing outside my bedroom door last night. Stayed inside until morning. September 7th. Found scratches on the inside of the crawlspace door. Why would there be scratches on the inside? September 12th. Called Linda. She thinks I'm being paranoid. Maybe I am. The final entry, dated September 14th, was just 3 words. Someone is here. I sat there holding that notebook, my hands starting to shake, and realized that Melissa Howell had not broken her lease. She had fled, and whatever she had been experiencing, whatever had driven her out of this house in such a hurry that she left behind her wallet and her clothes, was still here. I pulled out my phone and called Linda at the property management office. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. I left a message asking about Melissa Howell and saying I had found some of her belongings and thought she might want them back. While I waited for Linda to call back, I decided to check the crawlspace Melissa had mentioned in her notebook. I had seen the small door when I first walked through the house, tucked into the hallway between the 2 bedrooms, painted the same white as the walls and easy to miss if you were not looking for it. I grabbed a flashlight from my camera bag and knelt down in front of the door. It was about 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide, secured with a simple hook latch. I unhooked it and pulled the door open. The smell that rolled out was overwhelming. Damp earth and mold and something else, something that made my stomach turn. I shone the flashlight inside and saw a space that dropped down about 4 feet into a dirt crawl space that ran beneath the house. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the inside of the door I had just opened. Scratches. Deep gouges in the wood, dozens of them, concentrated around where the latch would be if you were trapped on the other side trying to get out. I should have closed that door and left the house immediately. I know that now. But in the moment, I felt compelled to document what I was seeing, to gather evidence that something was wrong here before anyone could dismiss it or explain it away. I took photos of the scratches, of the crawlspace entrance, of the notebook entries. Then I lowered myself down into the crawlspace itself. The ceiling was low enough that I had to crawl on my hands and knees, and the dirt floor was damp and cold beneath my palms. I swept the flashlight beam around, illuminating support beams and old pipes and spider webs thick enough to catch shadows. About 10 feet in, I found more items that clearly did not belong. A sleeping bag, folded and pushed against one of the foundation walls. A camping lantern. A plastic gallon jug filled with water. Someone had been living down here, or at least spending significant time here, and they had set up a small camp directly beneath the bedrooms. I moved closer and saw something that made my blood go cold. On the wall above the sleeping bag, someone had carved dates into the wooden support beam. The carvings were crude but legible, scratched into the wood with something sharp. The dates went back, over a year, irregular intervals, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes just days. The most recent date was September 13th, one day before Melissa's final notebook entry. That was when I heard the sound, a scraping, shuffling noise coming from deeper in the crawlspace, from the section that extended beneath the second bedroom. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and listened. The sound stopped. Then it started again, closer. Something was moving through the crawlspace toward me. I scrambled backward, my knees and palms scraping against the dirt, my flashlight swinging wildly and casting manic shadows across the support beams. I heard breathing, ragged and wet, and caught a glimpse of movement in the peripheral beam of my flashlight. A hand, pale and filthy, reaching out from behind one of the support posts. I did not wait to see what it was attached to. I launched myself toward the opening, pulled myself up and through, and slammed the crawlspace door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hook the latch, but I managed it and then dragged myself away from the door and stood in the hallway, gasping. I called 911. I told the dispatcher there was someone in my crawl space, someone who had been living there, someone who had been watching the previous tenant and was now watching me. The dispatcher asked if I was in immediate danger, if the person had threatened me. I said I did not know, but I was not staying in the house to find out. She said officers were on their way and to wait outside if I felt unsafe. I grabbed my keys and my camera bag and ran out the front door. I waited in my car, doors locked, engine running, until 2 police cruisers pulled up 15 minutes later. I explained everything, showed them the notebook, showed them the photos on my camera. They took me seriously, which was more than Melissa had gotten. 4 officers entered the house while I stayed outside, and I watched through the windows as their flashlight beams moved through the rooms. It took them 20 minutes to find him. His name was Aaron Vance, a 38-year-old man with a history of trespassing and stalking charges in Oregon. He had been living in the crawl space for over a year, accessing the house through an exterior vent that he had loosened and using the space beneath the floors to monitor whoever was living above him. When the officers dragged him out, he was wearing clothes that looked like they had not been washed in months, and his hands were covered in dirt and dried blood from where his fingernails had split from scratching at the walls and door. The investigation that followed revealed that Aaron had been doing this for years, targeting rental properties in the area, finding ways into crawl spaces or attics, and living there for months at a time, watching tenants through vents and gaps in the floorboards. Melissa Howell had reported him to Linda in early September, but Linda had dismissed her concerns and never followed up. When Melissa finally fled the house, Linda had simply cleaned it and listed it again, never bothering to check the crawl space or investigate why someone would leave so suddenly. They found evidence linking Aaron to at least 3 other properties in the Boise area, all rentals, all managed by the same company. He had videos on his phone, recordings of people sleeping, showering, living their lives, completely unaware they were being watched. Some of the videos were of Melissa. Several were of me, taken through the vents during the 2 nights I had slept there, my face visible in the glow of my laptop screen as I worked late into the night. I moved out that same day. Linda offered apologies and excuses and promises that the company would improve their security procedures, but I did not care. I broke my contract, found a new place across town in a modern building with concrete floors and no crawl spaces, and I have not done real estate photography since. I stick to outdoor work now, landscapes and commercial exteriors, anything that keeps me outside where I can see what is around me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound in my memory, that wet, ragged breathing coming from beneath the floor. And I think about all the houses I photographed, all the empty spaces I walked through alone, and I wonder how many of them had someone hiding inside the walls, watching, waiting, scratching their presence into the wood where no one would think to look. I inherited the cabin from my uncle in October, 3 weeks after his funeral and 2 months after turning 34. I am a high school history teacher in Burlington, Vermont, and I had not seen my Uncle Richard in almost a decade when the lawyer called to inform me I was the sole beneficiary of his estate. The estate consisted primarily of a small cabin in the woods outside Stowe, about 45 minutes from where I lived, and a modest bank account that barely covered the property taxes. The lawyer mentioned that my uncle had lived alone for the past 15 years and had died of natural causes, a heart attack while splitting firewood. There were no other relatives interested in the property, and if I did not want it, the state would auction it off to cover outstanding debts. I drove out to see the cabin on a gray Saturday in early November. The access road was barely maintained, more of a dirt path really, cutting through dense forest that had already lost most of its leaves. The cabin itself sat in a clearing about 200 yards from the main road, a single-story structure with wood siding that had weathered to a silver gray and a stone chimney that leaned slightly to the left. It looked exactly like the kind of place where a man would choose to disappear from the world, isolated and quiet, surrounded by trees that had probably been there for a century. I let myself in with the key the lawyer had provided and found the interior surprisingly well kept. My uncle had been a neat person, it seemed. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a wood stove in the corner and shelves lined with canned goods and old books. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom with a shower so small I could barely turn around inside it. The whole place smelled like wood smoke and old paper. Not unpleasant, but heavy with the sense of time passing slowly. I spent the first hour walking through the cabin, opening drawers and cabinets trying to get a sense of who my Uncle Richard had been in his final years. We had been close when I was young, before my parents divorced and my mother moved us away from Vermont. I remembered him as funny and adventurous, someone who told stories about hiking in Nepal and teaching English in Japan. But the man who lived in this cabin seemed different. His belongings suggested someone who had withdrawn completely from the outside world. No television, no computer, just books and notebooks and boxes of old photographs. It was while searching through the bedroom closet that I found the locked metal box. It was about the size of a briefcase, olive green, the kind of container you might use for important documents or valuables. There was no key, but the lock looked old and simple. I brought it into the main room and used a screwdriver from my uncle's toolbox to pry it open. Inside, I found something I had not expected. Police evidence bags. 6 of them. Each sealed with red tape and labeled with case numbers, dates, and brief descriptions written in faded black marker. The dates ranged from 1987 to 1992. The descriptions were clinical and disturbing. Clothing fibers from victim residence. Unidentified fingerprint card. Witness statement transcript. Each bag contained exactly what it promised. One held a small plastic baggie with what looked like carpet fibers. Another contained a set of fingerprints on a card with a handwritten note that read, "Unknown male, found at scene, no match in system." A third held a thick stack of photocopied pages, witness statements from people I did not recognize, describing events I had never heard about. I sat on the floor of that cabin and read through every document in the box. It took hours, and with each page, I felt my understanding of my family history shifting and cracking like ice breaking under weight. The evidence all related to a single case. In November of 1987, a 16-year-old girl named Jennifer Moss disappeared from her home in Stowe. She was last seen leaving school on a Friday afternoon and never made it home. Her parents reported her missing that evening, and a search was launched that involved local police, state troopers, and volunteers from the community. The search lasted 3 weeks and found nothing. No body, no evidence, no leads. Jennifer Moss simply vanished. What made the documents in my uncle's possession so disturbing was not just that he had them, but what they suggested. Among the witness statements were interviews with people who had seen a dark blue pickup truck near the school around the time Jennifer disappeared. My Uncle Richard had driven a dark blue pickup in 1987. I knew this because there were photographs in the cabin showing him standing next to it, smiling, his arm around a woman I did not recognize. Another statement described a man in his 30s with brown hair and a beard who had been seen talking to Jennifer outside the school library 2 days before she vanished. My uncle would have been 35 in 1987, and every photo from that period showed him with brown hair and a thick beard. The fingerprint card was the worst. It was labeled as being collected from Jennifer Moss's bedroom window, which had been found unlocked the morning after she disappeared. The prints belonged to an unknown male and had never been matched. Beneath the evidence bag containing the card, my uncle had written a note on a torn piece of paper. "They never asked for mine." I sat there as the light faded outside, trying to process what I was looking at. My uncle had kept police evidence in a locked box for over 30 years. Evidence from an unsolved disappearance. Evidence that seemed to implicate him, or at the very least suggested he had information about what happened to Jennifer Moss that he had never shared with authorities. I thought about calling the police immediately, but something stopped me. I needed to understand more first. I needed to know if my uncle had been involved or if there was some other explanation for why he had these materials. I started going through the rest of the cabin more systematically, looking for anything else that might explain what I had found. In the bedroom, I discovered a loose floorboard beneath the bed. Underneath it was a small space containing more documents. These were not police evidence. These were personal letters, dozens of them, all written in the same handwriting, all addressed to Richard, but never mailed. I opened one and immediately wished I had not. It was from Jennifer Moss, or someone pretending to be her. The letter was dated March 1988, 4 months after her disappearance, and it described being held somewhere dark and cold, begging for help, asking why no one was looking for her. I opened another letter, then another. They were all the same. Letters from Jennifer spanning from early 1988 through 1992, each one describing captivity and fear, each one pleading for rescue. But they had never been mailed. They had been kept here, hidden beneath the floor of my uncle's bedroom, in a cabin he had owned since the mid-1980s. I felt sick. I felt like the walls were closing in around me. My uncle, the man who had taught me how to fish and had bought me my first camera, had kept letters from a missing girl hidden in his home for decades. I called the police at 9:47 that night. I told the dispatcher I was at my late uncle's cabin and had found evidence related to an unsolved missing persons case from 1987. She asked me to stay where I was and said officers would be there within 30 minutes. I waited outside in my car, the box of evidence and the letters piled on the passenger seat, watching the dark shape of the cabin through my windshield and wondering how many other secrets were hidden inside. 2 state police detectives arrived first, followed by a forensics van and 3 more cruisers. I handed over everything I had found and gave my statement sitting in the back of one of the cruisers while they processed the scene. The lead detective, a woman named Sergeant Brennan, who looked like she had not slept in days, asked me questions about my uncle, about my family, about when I had last seen him and what I knew about his life in the 1980s. I told her the truth. I knew almost nothing. My family had fallen apart around that time, and my uncle had become distant and reclusive. They searched the cabin for 6 hours that night. I was not allowed inside, but I watched from my car as they carried out boxes of materials, photographed every room, and eventually brought in a cadaver dog that spent 20 minutes searching the property before sitting down near the stone foundation at the back of the cabin. Sergeant Brennan came over to my car around 3 in the morning and asked if I knew whether my uncle had ever done any construction or renovation on the property. I said I had no idea. She nodded and told me they would need to excavate the area behind the cabin where the dog had alerted. The excavation started the next morning. I was not required to stay, but I could not leave. I sat in my car and watched as officers and forensics technicians carefully removed dirt and rocks from behind the foundation. By early afternoon, they had found something. Not a body, a space. Someone had dug out a section beneath the cabin's foundation and created a small underground room, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with wooden support beams and a metal door that locked from the outside. Inside the room, they found remnants of fabric, a rusted metal bed frame, and scratches on the walls that looked like they had been made with fingernails or a piece of metal over a long period of time. They also found remains. Not complete, not identifiable by sight, but enough for DNA testing. Sergeant Brennan told me later, after the test came back, that the remains belonged to Jennifer Moss. She had not disappeared. She had been taken, and she had been held in that underground room beneath my uncle's cabin from November 1987 until sometime in early 1992, when she died. The cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the remains, but the evidence suggested she had been kept there for over 4 years. My uncle Richard had died of a heart attack in August. He had lived alone in that cabin, walking over the place where Jennifer Moss was buried, for more than 30 years after her death. The letters I found hadn't been written by Jennifer as cries for help. They had been written by my uncle, a sick fantasy or confession or attempt to process what he had done. The police evidence had been stolen from the department's storage facility in 1994, 2 years after Jennifer's death, during a break-in that was never solved. My uncle had taken it, kept it, perhaps as some kind of trophy or insurance. The case was officially closed in December. The state offered to buy the property from me so they could ensure the site was properly memorialized. I agreed immediately. I wanted nothing to do with that cabin, with that land, with any part of what my uncle had been. But I still think about it constantly. I think about the fact that I spent holidays with him as a child, that I looked up to him, that I believed he was someone worth admiring. I think about Jennifer Moss and her family, who spent 37 years not knowing what happened to her, who held on to hope that she might still be alive somewhere, and how that hope was finally extinguished by the discovery of a hidden room and a pile of evidence kept in a locked metal box. I still teach history. I still live in Burlington, but I do not talk about my family anymore, and I have stopped visiting places from my childhood. Some memories are better left buried, and some inheritances are curses that cannot be refused. I need to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm still employed at the hospital where this started, and I am still living in Michigan, though not in the house I am about to describe. I am 29 years old, a nurse practitioner specializing in emergency medicine, and I bought my first house in late November through a foreclosure auction. It seemed like the smartest financial decision at the time. The property had been sitting empty for over a year after the bank repossessed it, and the auction price was less than half of what similar homes in the area were selling for. My real estate agent, a man named Tom, who specialized in distressed properties, assured me that foreclosures often came with surprises, but rarely anything that could not be fixed with some elbow grease and a reasonable budget. The house was a small ranch on the outskirts of Ann Arbor, backing up to a wooded area that provided privacy from the neighboring properties. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a basement that had been partially finished by the previous owner. The exterior needed paint, and the landscaping was overgrown, but the bones of the house seemed solid. I closed on the property on a Tuesday and got the keys that same afternoon. Tom handed them over with a congratulatory handshake and a reminder that I should change all the locks immediately, since foreclosed properties sometimes had previous owners who felt entitled to return. I spent the first 2 days cleaning and taking measurements for furniture. The house had been stripped of most personal items, but there were remnants of whoever had lived there before. A few pieces of mail addressed to someone named David Kellerman, a cracked coffee mug left in a kitchen cabinet, a pair of work boots in the garage that looked like they had been abandoned mid-project. The basement was where most of the previous owner's presence lingered. He had clearly spent time down there. There was a workbench along one wall, pegboard with tools still hanging in neat rows, and in the far corner, a large chest freezer that had not been mentioned in any of the property disclosures. The freezer was unplugged, which I discovered when I went down to the basement on my 3rd night in the house to check the circuit breaker. The whole basement had lost power, and I assumed it was a blown fuse or a trip breaker, but when I opened the electrical panel, everything looked fine. I traced the problem to an extension cord that had been pulled from the wall socket. The cord ran across the basement floor to the chest freezer in the corner. Someone had unplugged it deliberately, and recently enough that the outlet still looked clean, no dust or debris. I walked over to the freezer and stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the lid, feeling the cold metal beneath my palm. It was locked. A small padlock looped through the latch mechanism, the kind you could buy at any hardware store for $5. I tugged on it experimentally, and it held firm. I went back upstairs and searched through the keys that had come with the house, but none of them were small enough to fit the padlock. I considered leaving it alone, just wheeling the freezer out to the curb for bulk trash pickup. but something about the deliberate unplugging bothered me. If the previous owner had simply abandoned the freezer, why unplug it right before leaving? And why lock it? I used bolt cutters from the garage to remove the padlock. It took more effort than I expected. The metal was cheap but thick, and by the time the lock finally gave way, my hands were cramping. I set the bolt cutters aside and lifted the freezer lid. The smell hit me immediately. Not the sharp chemical stench of decay, but something cold and preserved, like meat that had been frozen too long and then thawed. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it down into the interior of the freezer. At first, I thought I was looking at packages of meat. There were several large objects wrapped in heavy plastic and sealed with duct tape, stacked carefully inside the freezer. But as I looked closer, I saw details that did not make sense. The shapes were wrong, too irregular, too organic. I reached down and touched one of the packages, and through the layers of plastic, I felt something solid and unyielding. I pulled the package out and set it on the basement floor, then used a utility knife to carefully cut through the tape and plastic. What I found inside made me step back so quickly that I nearly tripped over the extension cord. It was a human leg, from mid-thigh to foot, severed cleanly at the joint, frozen solid, wrapped in plastic like something you would buy at a butcher shop. The skin was pale and waxy, the toenails still painted a dark purple color. I stood there, staring at it for what felt like an eternity, my brain trying to process what I was seeing, trying to find some rational explanation that did not involve a dismembered body in my basement. I did not open the other packages. I did not need to. I backed away from the freezer, pulled out my phone, and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the phone steady. When the dispatcher answered, I told her I had found human remains in my house and needed police immediately. She asked if I was in danger. I said I did not think so, but I was not sure. She told me to leave the house and wait outside for officers to arrive. I stood in my driveway for 20 minutes before the first police car pulled up. 2 officers got out, both looking skeptical, until I showed them the basement and the open package. One of them immediately called for detectives and a forensics team. The other asked me to wait upstairs while they secured the scene. Within an hour, my house was swarming with law enforcement. Detectives, crime scene investigators, a medical examiner, even an FBI agent who arrived later in the evening. They removed 4 packages from the freezer, each containing a different body part, a leg, an arm, a torso, and what the medical examiner later confirmed was a head, all from the same person. The investigation moved quickly after that. They identified the remains through dental records as belonging to a 23-year-old woman named Alicia Brennan, who had disappeared in 2003 while attending the University of Michigan. Her case had been classified as a voluntary missing person after investigators found evidence she had been struggling with depression and had withdrawn from school shortly before vanishing. Her family had insisted she would never leave without contacting them, but without evidence of foul play, the investigation had eventually gone cold. The previous owner of my house, David Kellerman, had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the university in 2003. He had access to student housing, campus facilities, and had been interviewed during the initial investigation into Alicia's disappearance, but was never considered a serious suspect. When the housing market collapsed in 2008, David lost his job and eventually defaulted on his mortgage. The bank foreclosed in early 2023, but by then David had already disappeared. His last known address was a motel in Indiana, but when police tracked him down, they found he had checked out 3 months earlier and left no forwarding information. The forensics team spent a week processing my house. They found trace evidence throughout the basement, blood that had soaked into the concrete floor beneath where the freezer had been positioned, DNA evidence in the drain of the utility sink, fibers, and hair samples that matched Alicia Brennan. The working theory was that David had killed her in 2003, dismembered her body in my basement, and kept the remains frozen for 20 years. When he knew he was losing the house, he unplugged the freezer, but did not have time to dispose of the evidence before the bank took possession. They never found David Kellerman. The FBI issued a warrant and placed him on their most wanted list, but as of now, he remains at large. The case generated significant media attention. Alicia's family held a memorial service and finally had closure after 2 decades of uncertainty. I was interviewed by reporters, by police, by FBI profilers who wanted to understand the psychology of someone who would keep evidence of their crime frozen in a basement for 20 years. The house was released back to me after the investigation concluded, but I could not live there. I tried for exactly 1 week before I hired a company to remove everything from the basement, including the concrete floor which they jackhammered up and replaced. I sold the house 4 months later at a significant loss to a developer who planned to tear it down and build something new on the lot. I moved into a modern apartment complex with security cameras and concrete construction, no basements, no hidden spaces, but I still think about it constantly. I think about how close I came to just throwing that freezer away without opening it, how Alicia Brennan would have remained missing forever, how her family would never have known what happened to her. I think about David Kellerman and where he might be now, whether he is living under a new name somewhere, whether he is killed again. Most of all, I think about the moment I opened that freezer and saw those packages, and how quickly your entire understanding of safety and normalcy can be shattered by what you find in a locked box in your basement. I want to start by saying that I am still working as a software developer in Austin, Texas, and I am still processing what happened in that duplex. I moved there in early November, just after my 27th birthday, having accepted a position with a startup downtown that offered remote work flexibility and better pay than my previous job in Houston. I had been searching for affordable housing for weeks, and the rental market in Austin was brutal. Everything decent was either too expensive or already leased before I could even schedule a viewing. When I found the listing for a duplex unit on the east side, recently renovated with modern appliances and hardwood floors, priced well below comparable units in the area, I jumped on it immediately. The landlord was a woman named Patricia, who owned several properties around the city and managed them through a property management company. She was professional and efficient during our communications, sending over the lease agreement within hours of my inquiry and arranging a quick walkthrough. The duplex itself was exactly as advertised. My unit was the left side, a 2-bedroom layout with an open living area, updated kitchen, and a small fenced backyard. The right side was occupied by someone Patricia described as a quiet, long-term tenant who worked nights and kept to himself. She assured me I would probably never even see him, which sounded perfect for someone who valued privacy and needed quiet space to work from home. I moved in on a Saturday, hauling boxes up the front steps and arranging furniture with help from a friend who had driven up from Houston. The unit was clean and well maintained, and I felt that familiar excitement of starting fresh in a new place. The shared wall between my unit and the neighbors was in the living room area, and Patricia had mentioned during the walkthrough that the duplex had been built with extra insulation to minimize noise transfer. I tested it that first night by playing music at a reasonable volume and listening to see if I could hear anything from the other side. Nothing. It seemed like the perfect setup. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 days later. I was working from home, sitting at my desk in the second bedroom that I had converted into an office, when I heard a sound through the shared wall. Not music or television, but a voice. A woman's voice, muffled but audible, speaking rapidly in a tone that sounded distressed. I stopped typing and listened. The voice continued for maybe 30 seconds, rising and falling in pitch, and then stopped abruptly. I waited but heard nothing else. I went back to work, assuming my neighbor had been on a phone call or watching something on his computer, but the sounds continued over the next week. Always during the day, always when I was home alone. Sometimes it was that same female voice. Other times it was what sounded like furniture being moved or dragged across the floor, heavy scraping, sounds that made the pictures on my wall rattle slightly. Once, late at night around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of someone crying, soft and sustained, coming from the other side of the wall. I lay there in the dark, listening, wondering if I should knock on the door and check if everything was okay, or if that would be overstepping boundaries with a neighbor I had never met. I decided to mention it to Patricia the next day. I sent her an email describing the sounds and asking if she knew whether my neighbor had anyone else living with him, or if there might be some kind of domestic situation I should be concerned about. Her response came back quickly and was dismissive in a way that made me feel like I was being paranoid. She assured me that her tenant had lived there alone for over 2 years, had an excellent rental history, and worked night shifts at a warehouse, which explained why I might hear unusual hours of activity. She suggested that the sounds were probably coming from outside or from another nearby unit, and reminded me that the duplex had excellent soundproofing, but I knew what I had heard, and it got worse. One afternoon while working, I heard what sounded unmistakably like a scream, cut short almost as soon as it started. I stood up from my desk so fast that my chair rolled backward and hit the wall. I pressed my ear against the shared wall and listened. Silence. Then, after a long moment, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the unit next door. I grabbed my phone and stood in my living room, debating whether to call the police. But what would I say? I heard a scream through the wall, but it stopped. I had no evidence, no proof that anything was actually wrong. I decided to wait and see if the sounds continued. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the building, every distant car passing on the street outside. Around 1 in the morning, I heard my neighbor's door open and close. I got up and looked out my front window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. A man walked to a dark sedan parked in the driveway, tall and thin, wearing a jacket despite the mild November weather. He opened the trunk of the car and stood there for a moment, looking down at something inside. Then he closed the trunk, got in the car, and drove away. The next morning, I did something I am not proud of. I went outside and walked around to the back of the duplex where the shared fence separated our small yards. His side was empty except for a few pieces of outdoor furniture and a metal storage shed pushed against the back wall. I looked around to make sure no one was watching, then climbed over the fence. My heart was pounding as I approached his back door, which had a small window covered with a thin curtain. I cupped my hands around my eyes and tried to see inside, but the curtain blocked most of my view. I could make out shapes, furniture, but nothing specific. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the ground near the storage shed. A phone. Not a smartphone, but one of those cheap prepaid flip phones you can buy at any convenience store. It was sitting in the grass like someone had dropped it. I picked it up and opened it. The battery was low, but still functional. I scrolled through the call log and found only 2 numbers, both unlabeled, both called multiple times over the past month. Then I checked the text messages. There was only one conversation, a series of messages that made my stomach drop. The messages were from someone pleading for help. Please let me go. My family's looking for me. I will not tell anyone what happened. The responses were brief and chilling. Stop asking. You are staying. If you scream again, I will make it worse. The last message, sent 2 days ago, was from the person being held. I hear someone next door. Please help me if you find this. I stood there holding that phone, my hands shaking, realizing that the sounds I had been hearing were not arguments or television shows. Someone was being held in the unit next to mine. Someone had been screaming for help, crying, trying to get someone's attention, and I had dismissed it. I had been sleeping with nothing but a wall between me and whatever horror was happening on the other side. I left the phone where I found it, climbed back over the fence, and called 911 from my unit. I told the dispatcher everything. The sounds, the phone, the messages. She asked me to stay on the line while she dispatched officers to my location. Within 10 minutes, 3 police cars arrived. I met them outside and showed them the phone, which I had gone back to retrieve. 2 officers approached my neighbor's door while the others secured the perimeter. They knocked, announced themselves, and when there was no answer, they forced entry. Stood in my driveway watching as officers entered the unit. There was shouting, movement, and then one officer came back outside and called for an ambulance. They brought her out 15 minutes later, a woman in her early 20s, pale and thin, wrapped in a blanket, barely able to walk on her own. The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, and it left with lights flashing but no siren. The police arrested my neighbor when he returned home that evening. His name was David Marsh, 41 years old, with no prior criminal record that would have raised any red flags during a background check. He worked night shifts at a warehouse, like Patricia had said, but he had been using his duplex unit to hold a woman he had abducted 3 months earlier from a grocery store parking lot. Her name was Rebecca Chen, a college student who had been reported missing by her family in August. The police had investigated her disappearance but had no leads. She had simply vanished. The details that emerged during the investigation were horrifying. David had been documenting everything. He had notebooks filled with detailed plans, surveillance photos of other women in the area, dates and times and locations. Rebecca was not the first person he had targeted, but she was the first he had successfully abducted. He had kept her locked in one of the bedrooms in his unit, soundproofed as much as possible with materials he had installed himself, though clearly not well enough to completely block the sounds. The phone I found had belonged to her. She had managed to get it during a moment when David had left the door unlocked and had thrown it out the back window, hoping someone would find it. The property management company and Patricia faced significant legal scrutiny after it was revealed that they had never conducted proper background checks or visited the property in over a year despite tenant complaints from previous renters in my unit who had reported strange sounds and odd behavior from David. Those complaints had been dismissed or ignored. I moved out of the duplex 2 weeks later. Patricia offered to let me break the lease without penalty, though by that point, I would have left regardless of the financial consequences. I found a place downtown in a high-rise with security and cameras and no shared walls. Rebecca Chen survived, though I cannot imagine she will ever fully recover from what she endured. David Marsh is awaiting trial on multiple charges, including kidnapping and assault. I still hear those sounds sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. The crying, the screaming, the furniture scraping across the floor. And I think about all the nights I heard them and did nothing. All the times I convinced myself it was not my business or that I was overreacting. I think about the message on that phone. I hear someone next door. She knew I was there. She knew someone was close enough to help, and it took me too long to understand what was happening. I need to be clear about where I am now before I explain what happened. I am 32 years old, a veterinary technician, and I am no longer living in Tennessee. I moved to Seattle in January, and I do not plan on ever returning to that farmhouse outside Nashville, though technically I still own the property because no one will buy it after what the police found there. I purchased the place in mid-November through an estate sale. The previous owner, an elderly man named Walter Harding, had died without any living relatives, and the state was liquidating his assets to cover unpaid taxes and medical debts. The property included 12 acres of wooded land, a 2-story farmhouse that needed cosmetic updates but had good bones, and a large barn that Walter had apparently used for woodworking and general storage. The real estate agent handling the sale was eager to move the property quickly. She showed me around on a cold afternoon when the trees were already bare, and the ground was covered in a layer of fallen leaves that crunched under our feet. The house had that abandoned feeling that comes from sitting empty for months, but it was structurally sound, and the price was so low that I could afford it outright with my savings. I had been looking for a place outside the city where I could have space for the animals I occasionally fostered through the veterinary clinic where I worked. And this seemed perfect. Quiet, private, surrounded by nature. I closed on the property on a Wednesday and moved in that weekend with minimal belongings, planning to take my time furnishing the place and making it my own. The house was mostly empty, except for a few pieces of furniture that had been too large or too damaged to sell. I spent the first few days cleaning and setting up my bedroom and kitchen, avoiding the barn entirely because it looked like it would require significant work to sort through whatever Walter had left behind. On my fourth night there, I was walking the property line with a flashlight, trying to get a sense of where my land ended and the neighboring forest began, when I noticed something odd about the barn's foundation. There was a section along the back wall where the ground seemed to dip lower than it should, creating a depression about 6 feet wide that ran parallel to the barn. I assumed it was just settling or erosion and made a mental note to have someone look at it eventually. But the next morning, I went back to examine it in daylight and realized it was not natural settling. Someone had dug along the foundation deliberately. The dirt had been moved and replaced, but not compacted properly, which was why it had sunk. I walked around to the barn's entrance and went inside to see if there was any obvious reason for excavation work. The interior was cluttered with old tools, lumber, half-finished projects, and boxes of miscellaneous items, but nothing that would explain why someone would be digging along the exterior wall. I started clearing out the barn, mostly out of curiosity, dragging boxes outside and sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. That was when I found the hatch. It was hidden beneath a large workbench that had been bolted to the floor, and I only discovered it because I was trying to move the bench and noticed it was covering a square outline in the concrete. I used a crowbar to pry up the hatch, which was heavy and secured with a rusty padlock that broke easily under pressure. Beneath the hatch was a tunnel, not a root cellar or storm shelter, but a narrow passage with wooden support beams and a dirt floor, descending at a steep angle into darkness. I stood at the opening with my flashlight, shining the beam down into the tunnel, and saw that it extended at least 30 feet before curving out of sight. The walls were reinforced with plywood and 2x4s, suggesting someone had spent considerable time and effort constructing this. I should have called the police immediately. I know that now, but in the moment I convinced myself there was probably an innocent explanation. Maybe Walter had been paranoid about natural disasters or government surveillance. Maybe this was a prepper shelter from decades ago. I descended into the tunnel carefully, using my flashlight to navigate the uneven ground and low ceiling. The air was stale and cool, and I could hear water dripping somewhere deeper in the passage. The tunnel opened into a room after about 50 feet. It was roughly 10 feet by 15 feet, with concrete walls and a ceiling supported by metal posts. And it was not empty. There were items scattered throughout the space that made my stomach drop. Personal belongings, women's clothing, shoes, purses, all arranged on metal shelving units like inventory in a warehouse. Each item had a label attached to it, written in neat handwriting with a name and a date. I picked up a purse at random and read the label. Christine Dover, June 1998. I moved through the room in a daze, reading labels, touching items that clearly did not belong to one person. A winter coat labeled Samantha Price, November 2003. A pair of running shoes labeled Emily Tran, April 2007. A backpack labeled Jessica Holbrook, September 2011. There were dozens of items spanning nearly 20 years, each one representing a person who had owned it. And in the far corner of the room, behind a partition made of hanging plastic sheeting, I found what I had been dreading. Remains, multiple sets of remains, in various stages of decomposition, some reduced to skeletal fragments, others more recently deceased. They were arranged side by side against the wall, each wrapped in plastic tarps and labeled with the same neat handwriting. I counted 7 distinct bundles before I backed away, my legs barely supporting me, and stumbled back through the tunnel to the surface. I called 911 from the barn entrance, gasping for air, barely able to speak coherently. I told the dispatcher I had found human remains on my property, multiple victims, evidence of serial crimes, She kept me on the line while dispatching officers, asking me questions I could barely process. How many remains? Were they recent? Was I in danger? I did not know how to answer any of it. The police arrived within 20 minutes, followed shortly by county sheriffs, state investigators, and eventually FBI agents. They secured the property and spent the next 3 days excavating the underground room and processing the scene. What they found confirmed my worst fears. Walter Harding had been abducting women for over 2 decades, bringing them to this property, holding them in the underground room, and eventually killing them. The tunnel connected to the barn and also had a second entrance that opened into the wooded area behind the property, disguised as a natural drainage ditch, which explained how he had been moving victims without being seen from the main house or road. The victims were identified through dental records, DNA testing, and the personal items Walter had kept. All of them were women between the ages of 19 and 35, who had disappeared from various locations across Tennessee and Kentucky between 1996 and 2015. Some had been reported missing and investigated extensively. Others had been written off as runaways or voluntary disappearances. All of them had ended up in that room beneath Walter Harding's barn. The investigation revealed that Walter had been a long-haul truck driver before, retiring in 2015, which gave him access to different cities and states and made it easier for him to identify and target victims without establishing a clear pattern. He had purchased the farmhouse property in 1994 and had begun constructing the tunnel and underground room shortly after, telling neighbors he was building a storm shelter. No one had questioned it. No one had any reason to suspect that a quiet elderly man living alone on a rural property was responsible for the disappearances of multiple women over 2 decades. The FBI connected Walter to at least 11 victims, though they suspected there might be more based on the size of the room and the amount of personal items that did not match identified remains. Some victims had been held for weeks or months before being killed. Others had died within days. The evidence suggested Walter had not followed a consistent pattern, which made it harder to profile him or predict his behavior. I cooperated fully with the investigation, providing access to the property, answering questions, and allowing forensics teams to search the house and land for additional evidence. They found journals in Walter's bedroom, hidden in a false panel behind his dresser, containing detailed entries about each victim, descriptions of their abductions, their time in captivity, his thoughts and justifications. The journals were disturbing in their casual tone, as if he were documenting a hobby rather than horrific crimes. The property was released back to me in late January after the investigation concluded, but I never returned. I hired a company to pack my belongings and put the house on the market immediately, but no one wants to buy a property where multiple people were murdered, no matter how low the price. The farmhouse sits empty now, and I continue to pay property taxes on land I will never set foot on again. I moved to Seattle to get as far away from Tennessee as possible. I changed jobs, found a small apartment in the city, and have tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. But I still have nightmares about that tunnel, about descending into the dark and finding that room full of labeled items, about the remains wrapped in plastic and arranged against the wall like they were inventory. I think about the families of those victims, some of whom waited decades for answers, and I am grateful that they finally have closure, even though it came in the worst possible way. And sometimes I wonder how many other properties like Walter Harding's farmhouse exist, how many other people are living on land with hidden rooms and buried secrets, completely unaware of the horrors that happened beneath their feet. I want to state something clearly before I continue. I'm 30 years old, a paramedic working in the Minneapolis area, and I still own the lakeside cottage in Minnesota where this began, though I have not spent a single night there since November. The property sits empty on the shore of Lake Vermilion, slowly being reclaimed by the woods that surround it, and I pay someone to check on it monthly, just to make sure it has not burned down or been vandalized. But I will never live there again. I cannot. I bought the cottage in early November through a private sale, not a real estate agent, but a direct transaction with the son of the previous owner, who had died the year before. His name was Marcus, and he was eager to sell the property quickly, explaining over the phone that he lived in California and had no interest in maintaining a vacation home in Minnesota that he would never use. The price he quoted was absurdly low for lakefront property, even considering the cottage was old and needed significant updates. When I asked why he was selling so cheaply, Marcus said he just wanted it gone, that the property held too many complicated memories of his father, and he needed to move on. I drove up to see the cottage on a Saturday in early November. The drive from Minneapolis took about 4 hours, winding through forests that had already lost their leaves and past small towns that looked like they had been abandoned decades ago. The cottage itself sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by tall pines and positioned maybe 50 feet from the water's edge. It was a single-story structure with cedar siding weathered to a silver gray, a stone fireplace visible through the front windows, and a small dock extending into the lake that looked like it might collapse if you walked on it. Marcus met me there with the keys and a folder of documents. He was in his late 40s, dressed in expensive casual clothing that seemed out of place in the rural setting, and he kept checking his phone like he was anxious to finish the transaction and leave. He showed me through the cottage quickly, pointing out the functional kitchen, the wood-burning stove, the 2 small bedrooms, and the screened-in porch that overlooked the lake. Everything was clean but dated, and there was still furniture and personal items scattered throughout. Things Marcus said I could keep or dispose of as I saw fit. We signed the papers sitting at the kitchen table, and Marcus handed over the keys with visible relief. Before he left, he paused at the door and said something I did not fully process at the time. He said, "My father spent a lot of time here in his last years. If you find anything that seems strange, just know that he was not well toward the end. His mind was going." I asked what he meant, but Marcus just shook his head and said it was nothing specific, just a warning that his father had become obsessed with recording things, keeping journals, documenting everything. Then he got in his car and drove away, leaving me alone with the cottage and the forest and the lake stretching out into the distance. I spent the first night there, organizing and cleaning, going through closets and drawers, separating items I wanted to keep from things I would donate or throw away. Most of it was standard vacation home fare, fishing equipment, old board games, mismatched dishes, bedding that smelled like mothballs. But in one of the bedroom closets, I found boxes of cassette tapes, dozens of them, maybe 60 or 70 in total, each one labeled with a date and a timestamp. The dates ranged from 1997 through 1999, and they were organized chronologically in plastic storage containers. I assumed they were music recordings, or maybe family recordings, conversations, or memories that Marcus's father had wanted to preserve. I brought one of the boxes into the living room and found an old cassette player in a cabinet beneath the television. I selected a tape at random, dated July 12, 1999, 11:47 p.m., and pressed play. What I heard was not music. It was ambient sound. The hum of wind, the creak of wood settling, the distant call of a loon on the lake. And then, after maybe 2 minutes, I heard voices. A man and a woman speaking in low tones, their words muffled but discernible. The man was saying something about a boat, about going out on the water in the morning. The woman responded, but her voice was too quiet to make out clearly. The conversation continued for several minutes before the recording ended abruptly. I ejected the tape and checked the label again. The handwriting was neat and precise, the same style on every tape I had seen. I selected another tape, this one from August 3, 1999, 2:14 a.m. More ambient sound, wind, water lapping against the shore, and then voices again, different this time, multiple people speaking, one of them laughing. The recording lasted about 10 minutes before cutting off. I went through tape after tape, and a pattern emerged. Someone had been recording the sounds around the cottage, specifically voices and conversations, at all hours of the day and night over a span of more than 2 years. The recordings were not continuous. They seemed to capture specific moments, as if the person doing the recording had been waiting for something to happen, then pressed record when they heard activity. But here is what disturbed me. The cottage had been isolated when I visited. The nearest neighbor was at least a quarter-mile away through dense forest. There should not have been voices audible from the cottage unless people were on the property or very close to it. I checked the dates on the tapes against what Marcus had told me about his father's ownership of the property. His father, Robert, had bought the cottage in 1996 and had used it primarily as a retreat where he spent weeks alone. So who was speaking in these recordings? I selected a tape from November 15th, 1999, 8:32 p.m. and listened carefully. The quality was poor. The recording distorted, but I could make out a conversation. A young woman was speaking, her voice strained, saying something about being cold, about wanting to go home. A male voice responded, calm and measured, telling her to be quiet, that everything would be fine if she just stopped struggling. Then there was a sound, like fabric tearing, followed by silence, followed by the click of the tape ending. I sat there in the dark cottage, the only light coming from the fireplace, where I had built a small fire earlier, and felt my skin crawl. I rewound the tape and listened again, trying to convince myself I had misheard. But the words were clear. Someone had been held against their will near this cottage in November of 1999, and someone had recorded it. I went through more tapes from late 1999, and the content became progressively more disturbing. Recordings of crying, recordings of someone begging, recordings of what sounded like a struggle, objects being knocked over, voices raised in panic or anger, and between these recordings were hours of ambient sound, as if the person making the tapes had been documenting everything that happened around the property, waiting for specific events to occur. I called Marcus that night. It was past midnight, but I did not care. When he answered, sounding groggy and confused, I told him what I had found. I described the tapes, the dates, the content. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Marcus said, "I told you my father was not well. He became paranoid in his last years. He thought people were coming onto the property, watching him, planning something. The doctor said it was dementia." I asked if he had ever listened to the tapes. Marcus said no. He had cleared out most of his father's belongings when he died, but he had not gone through everything in detail. He suggested I just throw the tapes away, that they were probably just recordings of wind and animals and his father's deteriorating mind creating narratives that did not exist. But I could not do that. The voices on those tapes were real. The distress was real. I called the police the next morning. A sheriff's deputy drove out to the cottage and listened to several of the tapes I selected. His expression changed as he heard the content, and he asked to take the entire collection as evidence. I handed over all the boxes, and he told me someone from the investigative unit would contact me within a few days. The investigation that followed took months. Forensic audio specialists analyzed the tapes and confirmed that the voices were real, not fabricated or imagined. The recordings captured actual conversations and events that had occurred near the cottage between 1997 and 1999. But here is where it became complicated. The investigators could not determine where the recordings had been made. The audio quality suggested the recording device had been positioned at some distance from the subjects, possibly hidden, in the woods or near the shoreline, capturing sound from people who were unaware they were being recorded. Then they made a connection. In November of 1999, a 19-year-old woman named Sarah Lindstrom disappeared while hiking near Lake Vermilion. She had been staying at a campground about 2 miles from the cottage and had gone for a walk along the shoreline one evening. She never returned. Her family reported her missing, and a search was conducted, but no trace of her was ever found. The case remained unsolved for 24 years. The audio from the tape dated November 15th, 1999, the one where I heard a young woman saying she was cold and wanted to go home, matched the timeline of Sarah's disappearance. Forensic linguists compared the voice on the tape to recordings of Sarah from home videos her family provided, and they determined it was highly likely the same person. The investigation expanded. Divers searched the lake near the cottage. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the surrounding forest. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the property for any signs of burial sites. And in March, they found her. Sarah Lindstrom's remains were buried in a shallow grave about 200 yards from the cottage in a section of forest that had been undisturbed for decades. The cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the remains, but the location and the audio evidence suggested she had been killed near the cottage and buried there shortly after her disappearance. Robert, Marcus's father, had died of natural causes in 2023. He was never charged with any crime because he died before the investigation could link him definitively to Sarah's death. But the evidence pointed clearly in his direction. He had owned the property where her body was found. He had made recordings that captured what investigators believed were her final moments. And there were other tapes, recordings from earlier years, that suggested Sarah might not have been his only victim. The investigation is still ongoing. The Cold Case Unit is reviewing missing persons reports from the late 1990s, trying to match voices on the tapes to other unsolved disappearances in the area. So far, they have identified 3 other possible victims, all women who vanished while visiting the Lake Vermilion area between 1997 and 1999. None of their bodies have been found yet, but the search continues. I cannot go back to that cottage. I cannot stand on that property, knowing what happened there, knowing that Sarah Lindstrom and possibly others were held, hurt, and killed while someone recorded their suffering like it was a documentary project. The cottage sits empty, and I have listed it for sale, but no one wants to buy a property with that history. So it remains mine, a burden I carry, a reminder of what I found when I pressed play on those tapes and heard voices that should have been silent decades ago. I need to explain where I am now before I describe what I found. I am 28 years old, a financial analyst working in downtown Seattle, and I moved out of the townhouse in suburban Seattle in January. The property is still under my name because the investigation technically closed and released it back to me, but I have listed it for sale and I am prepared to take whatever loss is necessary to be rid of it. I purchased the townhouse in early November through what seemed like a standard real estate transaction. The property had been listed for 3 weeks, which was longer than average for that neighborhood, and the price had been reduced twice. My real estate agent, a woman named Susan, who specialized in first-time buyers, assured me that the reductions were just the seller being motivated, not an indication of any problems with the property itself. The townhouse was part of a development built in the early 2000s, 3 bedrooms spread over 2 floors, attached to identical units on either side. It had been updated recently with new appliances and fresh paint, and the inspection revealed only minor issues that the seller agreed to address before closing. I signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon and received the keys along with a folder of documents, warranties, and maintenance records. Susan congratulated me on making a smart investment and reminded me to change the locks, a standard precaution she recommended to all her clients. I spent the first week unpacking and arranging furniture, working from home during the day and exploring the neighborhood in the evenings. The neighbors on both sides were friendly but private, the kind of people who waved when you saw them but did not initiate long conversations. The neighborhood itself was quiet and well maintained, with walking trails and parks nearby. It felt safe, normal, exactly what I had been looking for after years of renting apartments with paper-thin walls and unreliable landlords. On my 8th night in the townhouse, I I was organizing the garage when I noticed something odd about the wall space. The garage was a single car unit with storage shelves along one wall and a door leading into the house. But when I measured the garage from the inside and compared it to the exterior dimensions of the townhouse, there was a discrepancy. About 4 feet of space was unaccounted for, hidden behind what appeared to be a false wall covered with the same drywall as the rest of the garage. I knocked on the wall and heard a hollow echo. I ran my hands along the surface, looking for seams or access panels, and found a section near the floor where the drywall was not properly secured. I pulled on it gently, and a piece came loose, revealing a dark space behind. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox and shined it through the gap. Behind the false wall was a narrow room, maybe 3 feet wide and 8 feet long, with bare studs and insulation visible. And on the floor of this hidden space were boxes, several of them, stacked carefully against the back wall. I should have called the police immediately. I recognize that now, but in the moment, I convinced myself there was probably an innocent explanation. Maybe the previous owner had been using the space for storage and had forgotten about it. Maybe it was a construction mistake, leftover materials from when the townhouse was built. I widened the opening in the drywall until I could fit through, then crawled into the hidden room with my flashlight. The boxes were sealed with packing tape and labeled with dates, all from 2007. I opened the first box and found file folders, dozens of them, each containing documents that appeared to be photocopied police reports. I pulled out one folder at random and started reading. It was an incident report from the Seattle Police Department dated March 14, 2007, describing the discovery of stolen property in a residence during an unrelated investigation. The property included jewelry, electronics, and documents belonging to multiple individuals. Several names were listed as victims, and there was a note at the bottom indicating that the case had been referred to the prosecutor's office. I opened another folder. This one contained evidence logs and chain of custody forms, all related to the same case. The documents showed that various items of evidence had been collected, cataloged, and stored in the police department's evidence room. But there were handwritten notes in the margins, notes that did not appear to be part of the official record. One note read, "Removed March 22nd, items secured off-site." Another said, "Original logs altered, copies retained here." I went through box after box, and the pattern became clear. Someone had been systematically removing evidence from police storage and documenting the theft. The files contained copies of original evidence logs showing what should have been in storage, alongside copies of altered logs showing different information. The discrepancies were detailed and deliberate, suggesting someone with access to police systems had been manipulating records and stealing evidence for personal gain or to obstruct investigations. But the most disturbing discovery was in the last box. It contained personal items that matched the descriptions in the evidence logs. Jewelry pieces, watches, small electronics, all tagged with evidence numbers that corresponded to the documents I had been reading. These were not replicas or similar items. These were the actual pieces of evidence that should have been in police custody. Sitting in a hidden room in my garage, I backed out of the space carefully, my heart pounding, and called 911. I told the dispatcher I had found what appeared to be stolen police evidence in my property and needed officers to respond. She asked several clarifying questions, probably trying to determine if this was a legitimate emergency or some kind of confusion, but I insisted this was real and serious. 2 patrol officers arrived within 15 minutes, and I showed them the hidden room and the boxes. Their expressions changed immediately when they saw the evidence tags and police documents. One of them called for a supervisor, while the other asked me detailed questions about when I had purchased the property and whether I had any prior knowledge of the hidden space. The investigation escalated rapidly. By morning, my garage was filled with detectives, evidence technicians, and representatives from the Internal Affairs Division. They removed all the boxes, photographed the hidden room, and began tracing the chain of ownership for the townhouse. What they discovered was both shocking and complicated. The previous owner of the townhouse was named Michael Torres, a man in his 40s who had sold the property to me after living there for just under 2 years. But before Michael, the townhouse had been owned by a man named Robert Chen, who had purchased it in 2005 and sold it to Michael in early 2023. Robert Chen, as it turned out, had been a property and evidence technician with the Seattle Police Department from 2003 until his retirement in 2022. His job had given him unrestricted access to the evidence room and the ability to check items in and out for court proceedings or investigations. The investigation revealed that Robert had been stealing evidence systematically for years, taking items from closed or inactive cases that were unlikely to be reviewed or audited. He would alter the digital records to show that items had been destroyed or released to their owners, while actually keeping the items for himself. The hidden room in the townhouse garage had been his personal storage facility, a place where he could keep the stolen evidence without risk of it being discovered during routine home activities or by family members. When Robert retired and decided to move, he had sealed the room behind a false wall and sold the property to Michael Torres without disclosing the hidden space. Michael had lived there for 2 years, completely unaware of what was hidden in his garage. When Michael sold the property to me, the room and its contents were simply passed along, unknown and undisclosed. The evidence Robert had stolen was linked to dozens of cases spanning nearly 2 decades. Some were relatively minor property crimes, where the stolen items had little impact on the prosecution, but others were serious cases where the missing evidence had created problems for investigations and trials. In at least 3 instances, prosecutors had been forced to drop charges or accept plea deals because critical evidence could not be produced in court. That evidence had been sitting in Robert Chen's garage the entire time. The Internal Affairs investigation expanded to review all cases Robert had been involved with during his tenure. They found numerous irregularities and suspected he had stolen far more than what was recovered from my garage. But Robert Chen had died in 2024, 6 months before I purchased the townhouse, so he was never prosecuted for his crimes. The department faced significant scrutiny over how one employee had been able to compromise evidence integrity for so long without detection. I cooperated fully with the investigation, providing access to the property and answering endless questions about my purchase and whether I had any connection to Robert Chen or Michael Torres. I did not. I was simply a first-time homebuyer who had unknowingly purchased a property that had been used to conceal stolen evidence. The case generated media attention, though investigators tried to keep my identity confidential. Several victims whose stolen property had been recovered contacted me through the police department to express gratitude, saying they had given up hope of ever seeing their belongings again. One woman, whose grandmother's engagement ring had been stolen in a burglary in 2008, came to the police station to reclaim it after 16 years. She was crying as she thanked me, even though I had not done anything except accidentally discover a hidden room. The department offered to repair the damage to my garage from the investigation, but I told them not to bother. I was selling the property regardless. I could not live in a place that had been used to hide evidence of crimes, knowing that corrupt police work had been conducted from a space I now owned. The townhouse is currently listed, and my agent has advised me to disclose the hidden room and its history to potential buyers, which has made the property nearly impossible to sell at a reasonable price. I moved into a rental apartment in downtown Seattle in January, and I have not returned to the townhouse except to meet with contractors and the real estate agent. Sometimes I think about those boxes stacked in the dark, about all the cases that were compromised because one person decided to steal evidence for reasons I will never fully understand. And I wonder what else might be hidden in properties across the city. What other secrets are waiting to be discovered by unsuspecting buyers who just wanted a place to call home? I need to be honest about my current situation before I explain what happened in Chicago. I am 33 years old, a restaurant manager who has worked in the hospitality industry for over a decade, and I am currently living in a secure location under a protective arrangement that law enforcement established for me in December. I cannot provide specific details about where I am now, but I am no longer in Illinois. The apartment where this began, the one above the commercial space in Chicago's West Loop, remains part of an ongoing federal investigation, and I have been told I may need to testify when the case eventually goes to trial. I moved into that apartment in mid-November, attracted by the location and the price. The West Loop had been undergoing rapid development, with new restaurants and businesses opening every month, and finding affordable housing in the area was nearly impossible. When I saw the listing for a 2-bedroom apartment above a commercial space on a busy street, priced well below comparable units, I scheduled a viewing immediately. The landlord, a man named Vincent, who owned several properties in the neighborhood, explained that the commercial space below was currently vacant, but would eventually be leased to a retail business or restaurant. He assured me the noise would be minimal, and the location was perfect for someone working in the restaurant industry who needed to be close to downtown. The apartment was exactly what I needed. High ceilings, exposed brick walls, large windows overlooking the street, and a modern kitchen that had been recently updated. The commercial space below had a separate entrance on the street level, and Vincent explained that the building had been a small warehouse in the 1970s before being converted to mixed use in the early 2000s. I signed the lease that same day and moved in 2 weeks later, hauling boxes up the narrow staircase and arranging furniture in rooms that still smelled like fresh paint. The first few weeks were uneventful. I worked long hours at the restaurant, often coming home after midnight and sleeping until late morning. The building was quiet during the day, and I rarely heard any noise from the commercial space below. Vincent had mentioned that he was still looking for the right tenant for that space, someone who would be a good fit for the neighborhood and would not create problems for the residential units above. Everything changed in early December. I started noticing activity in the commercial space, lights visible through the small windows at street level late at night, the sound of vehicles pulling up to the loading area in the alley behind the building. At first, I assumed Vincent had finally found a tenant and they were setting up their business. But the activity happened at odd hours, always after midnight, and there were never any signs or indications of what kind of business was operating below. One night, around 2 in the morning, I was woken by the sound of voices in the alley. I got out of bed and looked out my bedroom window, which faced the back of the building. There were 3 vehicles parked in the loading area, all dark-colored SUVs with no visible markings. Several men were moving between the vehicles and the back entrance to the commercial space, carrying boxes and speaking in low, urgent tones. I watched for several minutes, trying to determine if this was a legitimate business operation or something else. The men moved quickly and efficiently, and within 20 minutes all the boxes had been unloaded and the vehicles had left. I mentioned it to Vincent the next day, calling him to ask about the new tenant in the commercial space. He seemed surprised by my question and said he had not leased the space yet, that it was still vacant and would remain so until he found the right fit. I told him what I had seen, and he became defensive, suggesting I had been mistaken or had seen activity at a neighboring building. But I knew what I had witnessed. The vehicles had been parked directly behind my building, and the men had entered through the door that led to the commercial space below my apartment. Over the next week, the activity continued. Always late at night, always the same pattern of vehicles arriving, boxes being unloaded, and then everything going quiet again. I started documenting what I saw, taking photos from my window and noting the times and dates. I also started noticing something else. During the day, when I was home between shifts at the restaurant, I could hear sounds coming from below. Not the normal sounds of a retail business, but mechanical noises, like equipment running, and occasionally voices speaking in languages I did not recognize. I decided to investigate more directly. One afternoon, when the commercial space appeared to be empty, I went downstairs and tried the street-level entrance. It was locked, with heavy security bars over the windows and no visible signage indicating what business operated inside. I walked around to the alley and found the back entrance, also locked, but with fresh tire marks in the pavement and discarded packaging materials in the dumpster nearby. I picked up one of the boxes from the dumpster and examined it. It was unmarked except for a shipping label that had been partially torn off, but I could make out part of an address in Mexico. That night, I heard something that changed everything. I was in my kitchen, making a late dinner after work, when I heard a woman screaming from somewhere below. It was muffled but distinct, a sound of terror and pain that cut through the ambient noise of the building. I froze, listening, and heard it again, followed by male voices shouting. I grabbed my phone and moved quietly to the floor, pressing my ear against the hardwood to hear better. The sounds continued for several minutes, screaming and shouting, and what sounded like furniture being moved or thrown. I called 911. I told the dispatcher I heard someone screaming in the commercial space below my apartment, that I thought someone was being hurt. She asked if I could see what was happening, if I knew how many people were involved. I said I could not see anything, but the sounds were coming from directly below me and they were clearly distress sounds. She said officers were being dispatched and to stay in my apartment and keep the door locked. 2 police officers arrived about 15 minutes later. They knocked on my door and I let them in, explaining what I had heard and showing them the photos I had taken of the vehicles in the alley. They seemed skeptical at first, asking if I was sure the sounds had come from the commercial space and not from the street or a neighboring building. But while we were talking, we heard it again. A scream, muffled but audible through the floor. The officers looked at each other, and one of them immediately called for backup, while the other went downstairs to check the entrances to the commercial space. Within 30 minutes, my building was surrounded by police vehicles. Officers forced entry into the commercial space, and what they found led to one of the largest human trafficking investigations in Chicago's recent history. The commercial space had been converted into a makeshift holding facility, with multiple rooms partitioned off with drywall and equipped with locks on the outside. There were women inside, 11 of them, ranging in age from late teens to early 30s, all of whom had been brought into the country illegally and were being held against their will. The investigation expanded rapidly. Federal agents from Homeland Security and the FBI took over, and my apartment became part of the crime scene. I was not allowed back inside for 3 days while they processed evidence and conducted interviews. When I was finally allowed to return, agents were still working in the commercial space below, documenting everything and tracing the operation to a larger trafficking network that extended across multiple states. Vincent, my landlord, was arrested as a co-conspirator. The investigation revealed that he had been leasing the commercial space to the trafficking organization for over a year, knowingly providing them with a location where they could hold victims before moving them to other locations. He had lied to me about the space being vacant, and he had ignored my concerns when I reported the suspicious activity. Several other property owners in the area were also implicated, all of them part of a network that provided safe houses and holding facilities for the trafficking operation. The women who were rescued were taken into protective custody, and several of them later testified about their experiences. They had been promised jobs and legitimate opportunities in the United States, only to have their documents taken and be forced into situations they could not escape. Some had been held in that commercial space for weeks, others for just days before, being moved to other locations. The screaming I heard that night had been one of the women trying to fight back against her captors when they attempted to move her. Law enforcement recommended that I relocate for my own safety. The trafficking organization was extensive, and there were concerns that I might be targeted for reporting the activity and cooperating with investigators. They helped me arrange a move to a different state, set me up with temporary housing, and advised me on security measures I should take. I left Chicago in December with just a few boxes of belongings, leaving behind the apartment and the city where I had built my career. The case is still ongoing. Multiple arrests have been made, and prosecutors are building charges against dozens of individuals involved in the trafficking network. I have been told I will likely need to testify about what I witnessed, about the sounds I heard, and the activity I documented. But for now, I'm in a place where I feel relatively safe, working at a new restaurant under a different name, trying to rebuild a life that was shattered by what I discovered beneath my apartment. I think about those women constantly, about how close they were, separated from me by just a floor and a ceiling, suffering while I slept and worked and lived my normal life, completely unaware of the horror happening below. And I think about how easily I could have dismissed those sounds, convinced myself it was nothing, ignored the signs because it was easier than getting involved. If I had done that, those women might still be there, or worse, moved to another location where no one would hear them scream. I need to explain my current circumstances before I describe what I found. I'm 25 years old, a delivery driver working for a logistics company in the Phoenix area, and I no longer live in the mobile home where this story begins. The property, located in a mobile home park on the outskirts of Phoenix, has been seized as evidence in an ongoing investigation, and I have been informed by detectives that I should not return to the area for my own safety. I moved into that mobile home in late November, desperate for affordable housing after my previous landlord raised my rent beyond what I could afford on my salary. The mobile home park was called Desert Vista, a collection of about 50 units arranged in rows on a dirt lot surrounded by chain-link fencing. Most of the residents were working-class families or retirees on fixed incomes, people who could not afford traditional apartments in the city. The park manager, a woman named Gloria, who ran the office from a trailer near the entrance, showed me the available unit on a Thursday afternoon. It was a single-wide trailer, maybe 600 square feet, with 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen barely large enough for one person, and a bathroom with fixtures that looked like they had not been updated since the 1980s. But the rent was within my budget, and Gloria said I could move in immediately if I had first and last month ready. I signed the rental agreement that same day and moved in over the weekend with help from a coworker. The previous tenant had left. Suddenly, Gloria explained, something about a family emergency that required them to relocate out of state. They had abandoned most of their belongings, and Gloria had cleared out the obvious trash, but left furniture and other items that might be useful for the next tenant. I was grateful for the furniture, a worn couch, a kitchen table with mismatched chairs, a bed frame in the smaller bedroom. It saved me money I did not have to spend. The first week was uneventful. I worked long shifts delivering packages across the metro area, coming home exhausted and falling asleep almost immediately. The mobile home was quiet except for the occasional sound of neighbors and the wind rattling the metal siding. But on my 8th night there, I started noticing something odd. The smaller bedroom, the one I was using for storage rather than sleeping, had a strange smell. Not mold or decay, but something chemical, like cleaning products mixed with something organic underneath. I opened the windows in that room to air it out and started going through the items the previous tenant had left behind. Most of it was junk, old clothes and garbage bags, boxes of paperwork and receipts, a few pieces of broken electronics. But when I moved the bed frame to check behind it, I noticed that one of the floor panels was loose. Mobile homes have thin flooring, usually particle board or plywood covered with vinyl or carpet, and this panel had clearly been removed and replaced multiple times. The screws were stripped, and there were pry marks along the edges. I pulled the panel up and found a space beneath the floor, maybe 18 inches deep, running the length of the bedroom. It was dark and cramped, filled with insulation and the metal framework that supported the trailer. But there was something else down there, a plastic storage container, the kind with a snap-on lid pushed as far back as I could reach. I grabbed a flashlight and pulled the container out, my hands shaking as I set it on the floor and opened the lid. Inside were personal items. A wallet containing a driver's license with a photo of a young woman named Lisa Moreno, a Phoenix address, and an expiration date from 2022. A cell phone, dead and covered in dust. A set of keys. And beneath these items, wrapped in a towel, was a journal. I opened it and started reading entries dated from early 2023, written in neat handwriting that became progressively more frantic and difficult to read as the dates progressed. The journal belonged to Lisa Moreno, and it documented her experience living in the same mobile home. She had moved in during February of 2023, and her early entries were optimistic, describing her relief at finding affordable housing and her plans to save money while working at a call center downtown. But by March, her tone had shifted. She started noting strange occurrences. Items moved from where she had left them. The feeling of being watched. Sounds outside her window at night, like someone walking around the perimeter of the trailer. By April, Lisa's entries became darker. She wrote about finding evidence that someone had been inside the trailer while she was at work. A window left open that she knew she had locked. Food missing from the refrigerator. Muddy footprints on the floor that were not hers. She mentioned going to Gloria, the park manager, to report her concerns, but Gloria had dismissed her, suggesting she was being paranoid or forgetful. The final entries from late April 2023 were terrifying. Lisa wrote about waking in the middle of the night to find someone standing in her bedroom, a figure she could barely make out in the darkness. She had screamed and turned on the light, but whoever it was had fled before she could see them clearly. She wrote about calling the police, but they had found no evidence of forced entry and suggested she install better locks. The last entry, dated April 28, 2023, was brief. "I am leaving tonight. I do not care about the deposit or my belongings. Someone has a key to this place, and Gloria will not help me. If anyone finds this, please tell my family I tried to get out." I sat on the floor of that bedroom, holding Lisa's journal, and realized with growing horror that she had hidden these items before fleeing, probably hoping someone would find them and understand what had happened to her. I pulled out the cell phone and tried to charge it with a cable I had, but the battery was completely dead and would not hold a charge. The wallet contained Lisa's ID, some cash, and a few receipts from local businesses, all dated from early 2023. I called the Phoenix Police Department non-emergency line and explained what I had found. The operator asked me to stay where I was and said an officer would be dispatched to take a report. 2 officers arrived about 40 minutes later, and I showed them the items, the journal, and the space beneath the floor where I had found the container. They took photos, collected the items as evidence, and asked me detailed questions about when I had moved in and whether I had experienced anything similar to what Lisa had described. I told them I had not noticed anything unusual, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that might not be entirely true. There had been moments when I felt like things were not quite where I had left them, when I thought I heard sounds outside at night that I had dismissed as animals or wind. The officers advised me to change my locks immediately and to report any suspicious activity. The investigation into Lisa Moreno's disappearance had been opened in May of 2023 when her family reported her missing after she stopped responding to calls and messages. Her car had been found abandoned at the mobile home park, and her belongings were still inside the trailer, but there was no sign of Lisa herself. The case had gone cold because there was no evidence of foul play, and investigators had assumed she had left voluntarily and simply chosen not to contact her family. But the journal changed everything. It provided evidence that Lisa had been experiencing harassment and had felt threatened enough to flee without her belongings. Detectives reopened the case and began investigating who had access to the mobile home and the park. What they discovered was disturbing. The park manager, Gloria, had been giving keys to occupied units to her son, Marcus, a 38-year-old man with a criminal history, including stalking and burglary charges. Marcus had been using those keys to enter trailers when residents were away or asleep, stealing small items and watching the tenants without their knowledge. He had been doing this for years, targeting women who lived alone, and Gloria had been covering for him, dismissing complaints and refusing to change locks when residents reported security concerns. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Marcus's residence, a trailer he shared with Gloria on the property, and found evidence linking him to multiple victims. He had collections of personal items stolen from various units, photographs taken through windows, and video recordings made from hidden cameras he had installed in several trailers. Among the items were belongings that matched descriptions from Lisa Moreno's family, suggesting he had been in her trailer multiple times before she disappeared. Marcus was arrested and charged with multiple counts of burglary, stalking, and invasion of privacy. But the most serious charge came when detectives discovered evidence suggesting he had been involved in Lisa's disappearance. They found her purse and additional personal items hidden in his trailer, items that had not been in the mobile home when she was reported missing. Marcus claimed he had found them after she left, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The search for Lisa Moreno intensified. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the mobile home park and the surrounding desert. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan areas where the soil had been recently disturbed. And in January, they found her. Lisa's remains were buried in a remote section of desert about 3 miles from the mobile home park, in an area that Marcus had been known to frequent. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Marcus was charged with first-degree murder. The trial is scheduled for later this year, and I have been told I will need to testify about finding the journal and the items hidden beneath the floor. Gloria was also charged as an accessory for her role in enabling Marcus's access to the units and for obstructing the original missing persons investigation. I moved out of Desert Vista immediately after the investigation expanded. The park has since been shut down by the city due to safety violations and the ongoing criminal case. I found a small apartment in a different part of Phoenix, more expensive, but with actual security and management that responds to concerns. But I still think about Lisa Moreno constantly, about how she tried to document what was happening to her, how she tried to get help, and how everyone dismissed her concerns until it was too late. I think about the journal hidden beneath the floor, about how she knew someone might find it eventually and hoped it would provide answers her family deserved. And I wonder how many other people have tried to leave behind evidence of what they experienced, messages hidden in spaces they hoped someone would discover, voices calling out from the past, hoping to be heard before it is too late.